His existence was teased ever since the start of the game, and he has been consistently name-dropped throughout the major regions. But finally, after about 5 years since Genshin's official release, Varka, the Grand Master of the Knights of Favonius and the current Knight of Boreas, will be releasing as a playable character in patch Luna 5 of nod-krai. With so much build-up and hype, there are high expectations for his performance as a character. However, the current popular sentiment is that Varka isn't very strong meta-wise, an opinion especially magnified if you followed the discourse during his beta. A lot is unnecessary doom posting, but there are plenty of valid criticisms about his kit. So to see how strong Varka actually is at the moment, as with all my guides, I will be explaining how Varka works, the best ways to build him, his potential best teams, and analyzing his place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Pretty much everything you need to know with detailed analysis that is backed by DC, including plenty of pre-release calcs on Varka from multiple different theory crafters for a more holistic meta evaluation. Varka is a 5-star Animo Claymore main DPS who ascends with crit damage. Instead of being a lunar-oriented character, after completing his Witch's Homework quest, Varka will be considered a Hexerai character, meaning he will gain special enhancements when there are at least 2 Hexerai characters on the team. Although Varka is an Animo character, he isn't really an Animo DPS. This is because Varka wields 2 claymores to dish out damage. One infuses with Animo, while the other infuses with one other element: Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, depending on the elements of the characters in his party. At C0, Varka deals about 30% Animo damage and 70% Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo damage, though the percentage of Animo damage Varka deals does increase with Constellations. If there are multiple different kinds of elements in Varka's team, he will infuse the element following the priority order of Pyro, Hydro, Electro, then Cryo. However, this priority system is largely ignored because of his A1 passive, which is important for his kit. To summarize the key part of it, if Varka's team has exactly 2 Animo characters and 2 characters of the same element among Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, all of Varka's attacks from his elemental skill's enhanced state, which is the main source of his damage, will do 220% of its original damage. If you only meet one of these team requirements, Varka's main source of damage will only do 140% of its original damage. Because the damage increase is a direct multiplier to his talent scaling, Varka wants to meet both of these team building requirements, otherwise he will lose a significant portion of his personal damage. Thus, Varka's teams need 2 Animo characters, then either 2 Pyro, 2 Hydro, 2 Electro, or 2 Cryo characters. And as a result, Varka will overall deal some Animo damage, but majority elemental damage of whichever dual element you pick for team building. To complement this, the other part of Varka's A1 passive gives him up to 25% Animo damage bonus and up to 25% Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo damage bonus, scaling with his attack, maxing the buff at 2500 attack. And with his A4 passive, all of Varka's enhanced state attacks will gain a stacking damage bonus buff when other members of the party trigger Swirl, corresponding to the Animo support he should be paired with. Varka's kit plays entirely around his elemental skill. Holding it allows him to leap for exploration, but after pressing it, Varka will deal Animo damage, generate 6 particles, and enter an enhanced state called Sturm und Drang. While in this enhanced state, Varka gains interruption resistance and empowered normal and charged attacks that deal both Animo damage and Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo damage depending on your team, with the non-Animo damage having the higher scalings in the talent. In addition, Varka's enhanced state allows him to have 2 charges to use a special elemental skill called 4 Winds Ascension, or a special charged attack called Azure Devour. Both consume 1 charge to deal extra damage. Currently, the special charged attack looks to deal slightly more damage in single target than using his special skill in Calcs, but his special skill has more AoE and is reportedly much more comfortable to use in practice. However, when Varka enters his enhanced state, he starts with both of these charges on cooldown, with each having an 11-second cooldown. To properly use these charges for extra damage, Varka can reduce their cooldown by half a second every time he hits an enemy with a normal attack up to 15 times. This base cooldown reduction, however, only allows him to use 1 special skill or charge attack within his typical field time. But if you have at least 2 Hexerai characters in the party, Varka's Hexerai enhancement makes his normal attacks reduce the cooldown of his charges by 1 second instead, which is enough to get 2 special skill or charge attack usages every rotation for his typical field time at C0. So to summarize Varka's overall gameplay, he does normal attacks in his enhanced state, which reduce the cooldown of his special skill or charge attack, which he can then use to deal more damage, ideally twice per rotation at C0. Other than his elemental skill, Varka's elemental burst simply does 2 hits of damage. The first hit will be Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo damage depending on the team, and the second hit will be Animo damage. Unfortunately, Varka's main damage buffing passives don't affect the damage of his burst. As a result, it isn't that strong, and it currently looks optimal to just not use his burst at all. Lastly, Varka's exploration passive reduces his hold skill cooldown in the overworld for every party member on the team that's from Mondstadt. That's everything on Varka's base kit. Since his elemental skill is the core of his kit, prioritize maxing that talent first. Then you can level his burst if you want, but if you plan to not use it, you don't have to level it. Next, let's go over Varka's Constellations. When Varka enters his enhanced state, C1 gives him 1 extra charge to use another special skill or charge attack, allowing for 3 empowered attacks per rotation instead of 2. In addition, Varka's first special skill or charge attack every rotation will deal more damage. With C2, each of Varka's special skills or charge attacks will deal an additional instance of animo damage, slightly increasing the overall amount of animo damage Varka does compared to non-animo damage. C3 increases his skill talent level by 3, which is pretty good because Varka's main source of damage is his skill talent. When Varka's trigger swirl, C4 allows him to buff the team's animo damage and the damage of whichever element he swirls for 10 seconds. C5 increases his burst talent level by 3, which isn't really useful. And lastly, C6 allows Varka to use 1 free special charge attack after he uses his special skill, or if you use the special charge attack first, he'll get a free usage of his special skill. Either way, it doubles his charge usage from 3 to 6 every rotation, enabling a lot more damage and gives Varka even more animo damage compared to non-animo damage. C6 also enhances his A4 passive, giving him an extra 80% crit damage at max stacks to all his attacks in his enhanced state. Varka does have decent constellations overall, such as C1, C2, and C3, and of course his C6 gives him the highest damage gain. Since Varka does generally deal the majority of the team's damage, the team damage increase from his constellations are respectable. And if we compare Varka's personal damage instead, we can see his constellations are in line with other modern main DPSs in terms of damage increase. Keep in mind that because Varka does more animo damage with constellations, it will change the overall effectiveness of using an attack goblet or an animo goblet. But while Varka's constellations are fine, they aren't the first priority for vertical investment because of his signature weapon. Let's now go over Varka's best build options. For weapons, his signature, Jest of the Mighty Wolf, is his clear best in slot by a significant margin. Crit rate substat and the special passive gives him a stacking damage percent buff after hitting normal attacks and when he uses his skill or charge attack. And when there are at least 2 Hexarai characters on the team, he also gets a stacking crit damage buff, giving 30% damage bonus and 30% crit damage at max stacks. His signature also gives 10% attack speed, which looks to add about 1 or 2 extra normal attacks into his typical rotation, allowing for even more damage. For 5-star Claymore alternatives, the 4 best options are 1000 Blazing Suns, Redhorn, Beacon, and Verdict. Other 5-star weapons like Fang of the Mountain King and Wolf's Gravestone are alright. For 4-star weapon options, unfortunately there aren't that many good choices. Serpent Spine from the Battle Pass is his best 4-star option on paper. However, maintaining consistently high stacks of his passive can be difficult without a shielder, which his current best teams don't have. Blackcliff Slasher is alright, but the passive doesn't really do anything against single target. Other than that, a good free-to-play weapon is Tidal Shadow, the Fontaine craftable. However, you may not always get healed in a Bennett team if you don't get hit, potentially decreasing its effectiveness, but in Farina teams with other healers, it will be very consistent. Here is a complete weapon comparison done by HyperWebster for Varka's personal damage in a Pyro team with Venti, Durin, and Bennett. The key thing to note here is that because of the amount of damage stats his signature gives, the attack speed which enables extra attacks, and the fact that his 4-star weapon options aren't the greatest, his signature weapon is very strong. It is about a 40% personal damage increase for him, which is significant since he generally does a large majority of a team's damage. Speaking of team damage, here is another weapon comparison done by Meowtwoos based on Varka's team damage in a double Animo double Pyro team. Feel free to pause to take a closer look. For those of you looking to vertically invest in Varka by pulling his signature weapon in Constellations, because his signature weapon is a significant upgrade over his other weapon options, it is generally his highest priority for vertical investment. It is much better to get his signature weapon first compared to getting his C1 first, and depending on your base weapon choice, his signature weapon can be a similar damage increase to getting his C1 and C2. To compare between 2 5-star pulls, getting Varka's C1 and his signature is better than getting his C2 without his signature. To compare vertical investment with 2 of his current best teammates, Durin and Venti, Varka's signature is by far the best signature, Durin's is okay and Venti's doesn't really matter, and for Constellations, Varka's C2 is a similar team damage increase with Durin's C2. Venti's C2 is not very important. Now for artifacts, since Varka is a Hexarai damage dealer, his best set will be the Hexarai set, which gives him a lot of attack and crit rate. But if you don't have a good set farmed yet, then both 4-piece Desert Pavilion and 4-piece Shimenawas are solid alternatives. Keep in mind that both sets do incentivize using Varka's charge attacks. Example altered combos are shown in the table below. For specifically Varka Hydro teams with Farina, 4-piece Marchese Hunter can actually be one of his best options. For main stats, Hourglass will be attack and Circlet will be crit. The Goblet is where it varies. For non-Pyro teams or Pyro teams without Bennett, Elemental Damage Goblet matching the element of the team and Attack Goblet are relatively similar to one another. But for Pyro teams with Bennett, because of his attack buff, Pyro damage Goblet will be better than attack Goblet. With Constellations increasing Varka's Animo damage compared to non-Animo damage, however, the effectiveness of attack Goblet and Animo Goblet increase. In non-Pyro teams or Pyro teams without Bennett, getting C2 and C6 will give a slight edge toward attack Goblet and Animo Goblet. For Pyro teams with Bennett, with Varka's C2, attack Goblet and Animo Goblet become on par with Pyro damage Goblet, and with the C6, attack Goblet and Animo Goblet both become slightly better than Pyro damage Goblet. For substats, Varka just wants crit and attack. Since his burst doesn't deal much damage, it doesn't seem to be worth using for optimal DPS, so you don't need to worry about energy recharge. But for those of you who do still want to use his burst to aura farm, Meowtwo's did calc various ER requirements for Varka for different team scenarios to burst every other rotation or every rotation. Feel free to pause if you're interested in the details. Now that we've gone over Varka's kit, constellations, and builds, let's discuss how to actually play him. In a similar manner to Skirk, a significant portion of Varka's damage comes from his normal attacks while weaving his special skills or charge attacks when available. As a result, optimizing Varka's normal attack combos can be a source of damage increase. Many different combos have been analyzed by TCers throughout Varka's beta, and of course it is very likely that new optimized combos will be discovered post-release, just like with what happened with Skirk. But as of currently, the one best overall rotation for C0 Varka that should also be fairly easy to execute is this. First, use skill to enter his enhanced state, then 5 normal attacks, which is his full normal attack chain, special charge attack or special skill, 4 normal attacks, another special charge attack or special skill, then end with 2 normal attacks or with a few more if you need to extend the rotation for certain teams. With his signature that gives attack speed, you can add 1 extra normal attack to the N4, resulting in a second N5. Varka's special charge attack and special skill are fairly similar. With our current knowledge, using special charge attack is slightly more damage in single target, but it is reportedly more clunky and difficult to use optimally in terms of timing since it needs to be animation buffered. In contrast, Varka's special skill is comfier to use and has larger AoE. Now if you have C1 Varka, which gives him an extra charge of a special charge attack or skill, his rotation slightly changes. After entering his enhanced state, you can do 1 normal attack into a special charge attack or skill, then do 5 normal attacks into a second special charge attack or skill, then do an N4 into a third special charge attack or skill, adding extra normal attacks if needed for teams with longer rotation times. With his signature, you can make the final N4 and N5 with an extra normal attack. Lastly, with C6, which effectively doubles Varka's special charge attack or skill usage, one example rotation you can do is special charge attack into special skill, 4 normal attacks, special skill into special charge attack, then do another N4 into another special skill and special charge attack. The attack speed from the signature doesn't really matter with C6 since you're doing a lot more special skills and charge attacks compared to normal attacks. But remember, all these combos are subject to change with post-release testing. Finally, let's go over Varka's best team comps. In this guide, I will reference team DPS calcs from theorycrafters Meowtwo's, Hyperwebster, Frost, and Jackson files to show how Varka's teams perform from multiple sources. But as always, remember that different theorycrafters will reach slightly different results because of differing assumptions including gearing, rotation time, buff up time, etc. So don't directly compare results of different theorycrafters or use the results to cheat PvP. And remember, the actual DPS number is never really that important as there is plenty of other key info that calcs provide, and calcs will always never 100% accurately reflect actual gameplay. Keep all of this in mind to ensure you consume TC healthily and responsibly. Due to how Varka's kit is designed, mainly because of his A1 passive, his teams need to meet 3 different conditions to maximize his own damage. First, he wants at least 2 Hexerite characters on the team so he can use 2 special skills or special charge attacks at C0 during his field time every rotation. Second, he needs to be paired with another Animo support for 2 total Animo characters on the team. And third, he wants either 2 Pyro, 2 Hydro, 2 Electro, or 2 Cryo characters as his final 2 teammates. Varka's Pyro teams are overall the strongest out of the 4 mono elements, with the best current team having Venti, Durin, and Bennett. Starting with the Anima support who generally holds 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, Venti is the best choice because he's a Hexerite character, and with his Hexerite buff, he gives Varka 50 damage % after Varka triggers Swirl on field. He also does some off-field damage while grouping enemies with his burst. If you don't have Venti, you have a lot of options, with Durin maintaining the 2 Hexerite requirement. One of the best alternatives is C6 Farazan. Even though Varka doesn't do majority Animo damage, 30% of his total damage still is Animo at C0, and C6 Farazan is just an incredibly strong Animo buffer. And if you have C2 Varka, which increases the amount of Animo damage he does, C6 Farazan is on par with C0 Venti. Both Sucrose and Kazuha are also good Venti alternatives that also have CC. They perform similarly, but Sucrose is uniquely a Hexerite character, which makes her open to Varka Pyro teams that don't have Durin. Lan Yan is also a decent option, mainly because of her shield granting extra interruption resistance and making weapons like Serpent Spine better in practice. Ineffa is also good because he holds TTDS, and instead of 4-piece Viridescent Venerer, he can hold 4-piece Scroll as a non-long character, meaning he can grant 40% damage bonus to Anemo and the element he swirled after triggering Swirl. Lastly, you can use Jean, mainly if you have her C2 which gives attack speed, allowing for 1 or 2 extra normal attacks, and her C4 which gives her burst 40% Anemo Res Shred. Her healing isn't that valuable with Bennett, but it will be more useful in Hydro teams with Farina. So you don't have to worry that much if you don't have Venti, as there are a lot of Anemo support alternatives that are close to performance in terms of Varka's team damage. And if you have Varka's signature weapon, every Anemo alternative will be better than C0 Venti with C0 Varka without his signature. In a fight where Venti's grouping matters, however, the practical difference will be a bit higher. Now for Pyro supports, Bennett is a strong attack buffer while also being a healer, and Durin is a Hexerai character, gives Res Shred, and deals decent off-field Pyro damage. If you don't have one of them, mainly Durin since Bennett is a common 4-star, your 3 Pyro support alternatives are Malwika, Shangling, and Toma. Malwika and Shangling mainly just for off-field damage, and Toma primarily for his shield. Durin is arguably the more important 5-star support when compared with Venti in terms of the team damage comparison between Varka Pyro teams with and without Durin, but just like with Venti, Varka's signature can make up the difference in damage while using one of the Pyro alternatives. Now if you don't have Venti or Durin, then one of the best free-to-play team options for Varka will use Sucrose as the second Hexerai character, Bennett and Toma for the shield. To give one example calc of Varka's overall Pyro teams, here is a table made by Jackson Files using his team calcs and comparing them in terms of team DPS, including different levels of Varka investment. The one thing I want to highlight here is that even if you don't have Venti or Durin, if you get Varka's signature, his free-to-play team will perform similarly to his best current Pyro team with Venti and Durin with all the 5 stars at just C0. Aside from his Pyro teams, Varka does have a decent amount of options for his Hydro teams, mainly playing around Farina. With Jean as the healer, you can use Mona as the second Hydro support as she holds TTDS and is a Hexerai character. If you don't have Constellations like Mona C4 which gives a crit buff, you can use Yelan instead. You do sacrifice the 2 Hexerai character team requirement, which means 1 less special charge attack or special skill from Varka, but it is somewhat balanced out by Yelan and Farina's off-field damage. If you have a Hydro healer like Kokomi or Sejuin, you can use them instead of Jean, allowing you to keep Venti on the team with Farina. Sejuin helps buff Farina's damage, and Kokomi is able to buff Varka with TTDS. For Electro teams, the 2 main Electro support combos are with Eon-san and either Fischl or Kujo-Sara. The teams function fine, but unfortunately, the Electro supports and Varka teams have limited capabilities. Eon-san can't use 4-piece scroll like she usually does because she herself can't trigger an Electro reaction, and how well Varka can maintain her buff through his movement is also subject to change post-release. Fischl is a Hexerai character, but the attack buff she gives to the team from her Hexerai passive doesn't work because you need to trigger Overload, and utilizing Sara's kit in practice has historically been awkward to do for most players. Varka's Cryo teams are currently the most limited in terms of support options. The one and only team which looks the best is with Escoffier for her off-field cryo damage and Shenhe for cryo damage buffs. That's pretty much the only good cryo team option at the moment. The other cryo support options for Varka aren't as strong.
Sitlali doesn't work for Varka, so your alternatives are Rosaria, which is pretty much just worse than Shenhe, and then there's Chongyun and Mika for cooldown reduction and attack speed, but that's more of a for-fun team rather than an actual strong option.
Lastly, Varka can be played in a team with Columbina and Ineffa, completely ignoring Varka's team building requirements in his kit. And due to the differing power levels between Varka's kit and Columbina and Ineffa's kits, the Columbina and Ineffa team is actually Varka's highest damaging team at C0R0 KKM standard, calcing slightly better than Varka's best Pyro team with Venti, Durin, and Bennett. Despite this though, I wouldn't heavily recommend using this team as Varka's alleged best team. With the context of endgame content, you're likely better off using Varka in his standard Pyro team to counter his shill and keeping Columbina and Ineffa to counter any lunar shill. With any vertical investment into Varka, the Benefa wheelchair team will scale much worse compared to his Pyro team, and any future buffs to Varka which he may receive with Nicole's release will make his Pyro team scale even better. To do one final sum up of all of Varka's teams, here are a ton of team DPS calcs done by Meowtus, all of which are compared to the top team of Varka, Venti, Durin, and Bennett in terms of team DPS. If you want a more in-depth look into these team calcs, including the actual DPS numbers, character builds, and rotations used, feel free to check out her full sheet, which I will link in the description below. To conclude this Varka guide, here is my analysis on his place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. I think the best word to describe Varka's performance as a DPS on his release is mid. Based on pre-release calcs, Varka's best teams at C0R0 put him at a similar level to early not-long DPSs such as Kanich and Chaska. This is far from being bad, but I wouldn't call it very strong either. As compared to many other recently released DPSs in their best teams, the damage Varka's teams are outputting is somewhat underwhelming. His actual kit is fine from a design perspective, and the damage gain from his signature signature weapon in Constellations are in line with other modern DPSs, it's just that he's starting from a lower baseline in terms of damage. Part of this issue of lower damage is because of his actual numbers in his kit, but another part are his current best 5-star supports. Venti and Durin are fine, but they aren't Ineffa or Llama levels of strong for their intended DPS, for better and for worse. But because of this, alternatives for Venti for instance are comparable in terms of damage unless you need a CC. And Varka's actual best 5-star support is very arguably his signature weapon, not Venti or Durin.
With how strong Varka's signature weapon is compared to other options, getting his weapon would make his lower damage issues not as profound, obviously intentionally designed by Hoyoverse to make you pull on his weapon banner.
Varka's kit is designed so that he can flex to being a Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo DPS based on the content he's up against by changing the elemental supports of his team, allowing for versatile team building. But the current damage of his teams limit the effectiveness of this versatility. His best Pyro teams are already at a lower baseline compared to other top meta teams, but his best Hydro, Electro, and Cryo teams are worse than his best Pyro teams. Now this is perfectly fine for content like Imaginarium Theater or lower difficulties of Stygian Onslaught where the DPS check isn't that high. In these scenarios, Varka being able to play in different elemental teams is a huge benefit, but in harder endgame modes like Dire, Stygian Onslaught, Varka being able to play in different elemental teams other than Pyro doesn't really matter since it will be very hard for them to deal enough damage to beat the content.
And of course, vertical investment into Varka to increase his damage would prop up his other elemental teams, making them more versatile in the content because they would do more damage.
Other than his damage, however, Varka's other big issue is the niche he fulfills in the context of the game's hardest endgame content, Stygian Onslaught. On his release patch, Varka's shield boss is the Hexadecatonic Mandragora. However, even though Varka is technically the best Hexrai DPS in the game, unlike the lunar archetype that have bosses with specific lunar mechanics, there are no specific Hexrai related mechanics in the game currently. As a result, this boss is more of a Venti shield boss since he splits into multiple groupable enemies. Varka in his best teams is effectively a mono Pyro DPS, but other Pyro DPSs can technically fulfill this same role and also perform well against this boss like Mawika. So even though this boss does shield Varka, there is less of a meta reason to pull for him when his boss can theoretically be easily cleared by other characters. You could argue that Varka is more balanced in his current state, which is better for the game's power creep, but this relies on future characters being balanced in a similar way, which likely won't happen. Despite all of Varka's current issues, I do think he is very likely to get a major buff in the near future, mainly with the release of Nicole. As a member of the Hexen Circle, it is almost certain that Nicole will be Hexarai related, potentially as a dedicated support for Hexarai teams. She is rumored to be a Pyro shielder as well. Assuming this is the case, in Varka's current best in slot team with Venti, Durin, and Bennett, Nicole will likely be the Bennett replacement. Now since Bennett is arguably the strongest support throughout Genshin's entire history, it does initially seem difficult to believe that Nicole would be able to give a big damage buff to Varka's Pyro teams over Bennett's attack buff. However, this isn't actually too unrealistic to think about. First, because Varka's multipliers are lower compared to other DPSs, Bennett doesn't actually give as much damage to Varka with his buff compared to another DPS like Mawika. Second, Hoyoverse has already shown to make niche supports that give very significant damage buffs for their specific team. They've done it with Escoffier and Skirk, they've done it with Ineffa and Flint's, and they've done it with Llama and Nefer, so they can easily do the same thing with Nicole and Varka. And third, while these dedicated supports have been typically released before their intended DPS, Hoyoverse is looking to reverse this release order. In the patch after Varka, it is rumored that Linnea will be releasing as a 5-star lunar crystallized support 2 patches after Zibai's release. Nicole can just as easily follow this same release schedule with a similar role. If Nicole is anywhere near the level of support as Escoffier, Ineffa, or Llama, C0 Varka's Pyro team can easily reach the same level as the lunar DPSs with Columbina. Now even with a damage buff from Nicole, there are still some issues. Nicole would only fix Varka's Pyro teams, as the non-Pyro teams are still going to have the same damage issues, further shoehorning Varka as a mono Pyro DPS. Other dedicated supports would have to be released to address Varka's other elemental teams, which may or may not happen. Lohin or Rowan could be the first example of this, but at the moment we aren't really sure what he does. In addition, Nicole is rumored to release 2 patches after Varka's patch. By the expected time of a release, nod-krai will be almost over, so even if Varka gets a big damage buff from Nicole, by then the start of Shinesnaya would be very soon, which would almost certainly release more new stronger characters that further push the game's damage ceiling. But of course, regardless, a buff would be a buff and would be greatly appreciated. So in conclusion, Varka on release isn't bad, but he isn't insanely strong. He's just kinda mid. From a meta perspective, there isn't really a good reason to pull for Varka, especially if you don't have Venti and or Durin already, or don't plan to pull his signature weapon. He's a fairly skippable DPS at the moment meta-wise, but of course, if you really like Varka and don't care for meta, don't feel discouraged from pulling. Varka's team flexibility by being able to play in Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo teams can still shine against less difficult content.
If you plan to pull his signature weapon, it would alleviate Varka's lower damage
that Calcs currently suggests, and he is likely to get some significant damage buffs with future character releases. That's everything I wanted to cover about Varka. As always, a big shout out and thanks to the theorycrafters who allowed me to reference their calcs in this video, specifically Meowtooth, Hyperwebster, Frost, and Jackson Files. They are all great and hardworking theorycrafters who were indispensable in the creation of this guide. Links to their socials and or full sheets will be in the description below. I highly recommend checking them out. I hope this guide and analysis was helpful to you all in giving you a better understanding of everything related to Varka. Just clicking and watching the video helps the channel out immensely, but if you want to show even more support, consider liking or sharing the video, or click the subscribe button for more Genshin guide and analysis videos in the future. Leave any questions in the comments, and for all of you planning on wishing, I wish you all the best of luck on your Varka pulls.